This is Making Stitches, and this time we hear about a European road trip with a difference.
Planned out a rough itinerary, taking in some textile locations, things that I wanted to see, people I wanted to interview, other friends who I knew would be able to put me up. So step by step, I sort of, dotted around. I went back to Brussels where I'd worked, which was completely in contrast to my previous life, driving through the streets looking like a hippie in a wallpapered van, whereas just a few years earlier I'd been this Eurocrat, really. And then branched out and just set off into the French countryside, not really knowing where the road would lead. It was wonderful.
Hello and welcome to the 30th episode of Making Stitches. I'm Lindsay and I'm thrilled to be able to share this episode with you. Now, this summer, just like last year, we'll see many of us staycationing close to home rather than hopping onto planes and ferries in search of more exotic destinations. In the time before COVID, my guest for today's episode set off on a voyage of discovery, creativity and adventure. Leaving a career in journalism with the BBC behind her, she packed up her vintage wallpaper-covered 1986 Bedford Bambi van with a few possessions, including a hand-crank sewing machine and a collection of her own handmade hats, to go on a tour of France, Belgium and across the Alps to Italy. Mary Jane Baxter was used to travelling alone during her time as Brussels correspondent for the BBC. This time, though, she arrived in European towns and cities as a tourist rather than a reporter, scouring antiques fairs and hosting pop-up craft workshops to help fund her travels. Mary Jane ended her road trip in Scotland, where she'd spent a lot of childhood holidays with her Scottish mother, and it's there she set to work writing her new book, Sew on the Go, which chronicles her travels and contains craft projects for readers to try, as well as a searingly honest account of the ups and at times painfully lonely downs of solo travelling. I was thrilled that Mary Jane agreed to come onto the podcast to share some tales of her adventure. First of all, Mary Jane, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to me for Making Stitches. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, Sew on the Go. And I guess I've kind of lived vicariously through your adventures through Europe in Bambi, and it's been absolutely wonderful.
I'm so pleased, Lindsay. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to join you.
First of all, can I take you back to your background and before we actually talk about the book, and just about your creativity as a person growing up and how that worked with your very exciting career that you had?
Well, I think, like a lot of your listeners, I was lucky to grow up with a mum and a dad who were both very creative. And my mum taught me how to sew at a very early age. I remember her getting out the sewing machine. She used to sew a lot herself, and she taught me how to use it. And so from an early age, I was making stuff, and particularly sewing things. And as a teenager, I loved clothes. I loved, that whole thing about being able to create an image around yourself. And I liked quite unusual things, but I couldn't afford them. And so I really enjoyed making things for myself as a teenager, growing up in South Wales. I used to go to the Laura Ashley fabric sale, because Laura Ashley used to have fantastic fabric sales. Laura Ashley used to exist. I don't think it does anymore, does it?
No, I'm not sure it does.
Yeah, I think it's folded. But I used to go and buy fabric in the sales for £1 a metre or something, and then make these slightly crazy outfits for myself. But I remember a decision at school. Back in the day, it was O-levels rather than GCSEs in the UK. And I remember having to choose between Latin and textiles, O-levels. And my mum was really trying to push me, I think, a bit towards the academic route. And she said, I think you should do Latin. You can always do sewing at any other time. You can always do textiles in your own time. And so I remember this decision, this big sort of decision about taking textiles or not. And I took Latin, and that sort of sent me on a trajectory of more of an academic path, I suppose. And so I did an English degree at university and went on to do a teacher training in English and drama. But I always loved making things. And in fact, when I was a university student, I used to make hats just for fun. And my parents owned a little gift shop in Chepstow in South Wales. And so I used to be allowed to sell things in the shop. So I'd make hats and sell them in the shop and make various things and sell them. And I was always astonished when people actually bought them. But I loved doing that. And so I had that avenue was open to me from a very early age, really.
Oh, how wonderful that you had the support at home setting you off on that route, but then also had an outlet in which to sell your products at the end. That's wonderful.
It's I think back to it now, it was a real opportunity, because these days I work for a charitable organisation in Greenwich, and I run a shop and a gallery for them called Made in Greenwich, which sells the work of about 80 local artists and makers. And we have lots of conversations about making, about selling your work, about how to price it, how to do your audience research, all of those things. And I realised that without even thinking of it, I had those opportunities as a teenager. And I think a lot of makers face this conundrum, really. It's either a hobby or you start to investigate it as something more serious. And that's often when some of the problems come in, I think, for a lot of people. And me being able to write about making and link up my journalism, which, as you know, is the career I went into, with the making, that has been the ideal vehicle for me, really.
Yes. Did you find that your career in journalism, which I can imagine was totally all-consuming, having to be on call all hours of the day, 7 days a week, did that really inhibit your creativity away from work?
Yeah, it did. And I think that's why I made the choice at the age of about 35. Maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe it was 45. Time plays tricks, doesn't it? I worked my way up the ladder at the BBC. So my first job was in BBC local radio in Gloucestershire. And I worked my way up the ladder. I wanted to be Kate Adie. I thought being a foreign correspondent would be the most exciting thing. So I worked and worked and worked. And at about the age of 35, I managed to get a job as a regional correspondent and producer in Brussels for the BBC, which was amazing. I couldn't quite believe I'd done it. And so I went off to Brussels. It was an absolutely incredible job, really. I'd already lived in France for 2 years working for Euronews, a pan-European television channel in France. And so off I went to Brussels, feeling that I was on the cusp of this career as a foreign correspondent. But it soon began to dawn on me, as you say, Lindsay, that this career that I'd worked so hard to sort of carve out for myself was actually inhibiting my creative side. Because, as you say, I was on call all the time. We were never at home for long before the phone went. Usually it was to go and cover some awful story somewhere. Something terrible had happened somewhere, and you just had to drop everything and go. And in the book, in fact, I talk about how, on my first week in the job in Brussels, I was finishing up for the day at about 6:00, and the phone went, and there'd been a crash in a road tunnel in Switzerland. And on my own, I had to get on the plane, at about 9:00 at night, fly to Switzerland, pick up a hire car, drive through the night with the recording and live equipment, and start reporting at 5:00 in the morning, from this tunnel fire. And that was in week 1. Had no sat nav in those days, nothing like that. And it was very exciting, but I began to feel quite stressed by it. And I brought my sewing machine with me to Brussels, and it just sat in the corner. And occasionally I'd try and start making something, but it always felt I had to make it under pressure because I never knew how much time I'd have. And I remember once buying one of those ready-made painting canvases from an art shop, thinking, I've just got to make something. And I bought some sample pots of paint and just started slapping them on this canvas. And I've still got that painting somewhere. And it really, it was just this sort of desperate attempt to try and make something in the limited time I had. And I know it sounds rather spoilt, really, because, it was a wonderful opportunity and I had worked hard to get there. And I realised how lucky I was, but something wasn't right. And I began to experience the odd panic attack, which I'd had before. I used to go down to the flea market in Brussels whenever I had any time off and think, this is where I want to be. This is what I enjoy doing. And I'd made this local friend and we would go to the brocantes together and look at lovely old stuff. And then off I'd go to, do some story or other. And about 2 years into the job, I just thought, this isn't working really. What am I doing? And I had a bit of a crisis, I suppose. And so I was, in my late 30s. I went to see my boss. I thought about making hats, learning how to make hats properly because I'd always made them for fun. And I went to see my boss, Andrew Roy, who was head of the Brussels bureau, and said, "I'm sorry, Andrew, but I'm leaving. I'm going to go make hats. I'm going to learn how to make hats." And he was really shocked and tried to persuade me to stay. But I've sort of made my mind up, really.
That must have been a huge decision.
It wasn't. Sometimes you have those decisions that you just have to make.
Yeah.
No matter how odd they seem from the outside, or no matter how terrifying, it actually seemed a very simple decision to me. It just felt like the right thing to do. And I've always been somebody who tries to go with their gut feeling about things. Now, I know we can't always distinguish what our gut is saying. Nobody's ever asked me to marry them, but I imagine I'd have, I hope I'd have that same feeling that if somebody did ask me that, I'd know instinctively how I felt. And that's how I felt about leaving Brussels. It just felt instinctively the right thing to do, although it was absolutely leaping into the unknown, really. Although I did manage to scrape together enough to put down a deposit on a tiny flat in London, which was probably the last leg of possibility of getting onto that property ladder. So I did have that, but I had no job lined up. I mean, I was pretty stupid, perhaps. I decided to go freelance. I went to London. I enrolled on an HNC in millinery at the Kensington and Chelsea College, and I just leapt into the unknown. And I did sometimes think, and certainly I'm sure my friends perhaps thought, what on earth had she done? This was a great career you're throwing away here. I was freelancing at the BBC, so I freelanced on the foreign desk in London, and I did my HNC. And without that freelance work, it wouldn't have been possible. But yeah, sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. So what was it then that made you take that further leap to give up on the journalism altogether and follow your creative path all over the place?
Well, I don't feel I've ever given up on journalism altogether, to be honest. For me, the whole thing is all about communication. And it's either communicating through making or through words or through sharing in some sort of a way. But after finishing the HNC in millinery, I worked with Stephen Jones for a couple of years. He's a milliner in Covent Garden, very well known, a bit like Philip Tracy. So I worked there part-time. I kept working at the BBC. I was juggling. I was writing a little bit about making for some magazines, and I did a series for the BBC all about make, do and mend for Newsnight. And in fact, the Newsnight series was all pinned on this idea I had about travelling around Britain and looking into the resurgence of make, do and mend during the financial crash. And I just really enjoyed it. I had a little Nissan Micra at the time that a friend had sold to me. And I travelled around the country interviewing people, staying overnight with complete strangers who got in touch with Newsnight in exchange for doing something for them. So I made trousers for a stilt walker. I created a hat for somebody to go to Ascot with. I met a monk who was living self-sufficiently, and I darned a jumper in exchange for accommodation. I exchanged a hotel night in Edinburgh for a handmade hat. And I travelled around doing these reports, and I really enjoyed it. I loved this combination of travel and making and writing and sharing. And so that idea always stuck in my mind. And I thought, gosh, it would be much better to do it really in a really cute van or something rather than the Nissan Micra. So I sort of parked that idea in my head. And then I did a bit more television. I did a series for BBC Two called Handmade Revolution. And I thought, I wonder if there's any way that I could revisit this idea of a journey in a sort of televisual vehicle, if you like. And time went on, and by the time I came into my mid-40s, I was still freelancing at the BBC, still writing, still juggling, and felt that I'd made these decisions and taken this path with no real outcome, I suppose. I did publish 2 books in the meantime, one called Chic on a Shoestring, and one called Modern Girl's Guide to Hat Making, which are published with Kyle Books. So I did do something, but I just began to feel more and more restless again, sitting on the desk in London, not travelling, because I'd made that decision not to travel for the BBC anyway. And I just thought, what am I doing? I'm careering towards 50, sitting in a big newsroom in the centre of London. What on earth am I doing? What have I made all these decisions for, really? And so when they were looking for people to take voluntary redundancy, I said, I'll do it, I'll go. And I had a small payoff. It wasn't massive because I was freelance again, really. It'd only been part-time. Enough to buy a little van with some money I was left a bit by my uncle as well. And I thought, right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to revisit that journey that I made for Newsnight, but I'll do it on a grander scale, and I'll have a cute van to do it in.
And it certainly is. How did you find Bambi?
Oh, well, I test-driven, by that stage, I'd test-driven a few different vehicles, none of it which felt quite right. They were, I like old vehicles, but they didn't feel quite safe enough or quite easy enough to drive or too expensive. And I was walking in Greenwich Park and I saw this cute little van and went over to chat to the owner, and I said, oh, what's this? He said, it's a Bedford Bambi. I'd never heard of that. And I said, oh, how does it feel to drive? I went, hop in, take a drive if you want. So I just drove it around the park and I thought, oh, this isn't bad actually, this could work. So I started to look at Bedford Bambis online, and I saw one in Southampton at a garage there for about £5,000, I think it was. And I thought, well, that's just about affordable. So I went down on the train and I bought it and drove it back. And that's how I found Bambi.
Wow. And you certainly made her beautiful with all the additions and the wallpaper. Why did you want to make her so different from how she was when you first found her?
Well, as I say to many of the artists and makers who now sell their work at Made in Greenwich, you're in a competitive market when you are a maker, and you've got to make yourself stand out from the crowd, to be honest, in whatever way you choose to do that. And I thought having a mobile craft studio would be a good way to do that, but actually a white van that didn't look particularly appealing wasn't going to really cut it. So my initial thought was, let's really paint it or, do something like that, but it didn't quite work. I tried doing a patchwork design with paint and it looked a bit amateurish. And then I found previously some old wallpaper sample books in this skip in Brighton, and I'm a bit like that. I do hoard things a bit. So I pulled them out and I thought, oh, let's try this. So I just slapped some of the wallpaper squares onto Bambi with some PVA and I varnished over them, and everyone laughed at me and said, this is stupid, you can't wallpaper a vehicle. But actually it worked, and it rained and it snowed and they didn't come off, and I thought, right, let's do it. So I just covered the whole van in these wallpaper samples, and it really got attention, and I thought, oh, this is the sort of thing that might work. And it was just experimenting really, and I just thought there's no point in having this mobile craft studio if it doesn't look creative and it doesn't stand out from the crowd. And I actually really enjoy doing it as well, because I think a lot of stitching projects can be quite small. A lot of making can be quite small scale. So it was great to do something on a large scale. And I lived, time in a tiny flat with no space to do anything. And so part of my thinking was, well, if I have this van, I can go and sit in there and make stuff, So I parked it outside flat and, used that as my creative project, really.
And I believe the neighbours were a little bit disparaging of your project at the time, weren't they?
They certainly were, yeah. They were just all, that's a clapped out old thing. You're going to take that around Europe? You must be joking. They weren't exactly encouraging. And it's all done in a very public space when you've got a flat and you live on the street. Everyone can see what you're doing. So I couldn't really do it in secret. I was out there with my ladder and my wallpaper books and my PVA glue, and they just laughed at me, really. But laughs on me now.
Yes, it came off with knobs on.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about the beginning of your journey, because once Bambi was roadworthy and looking beautiful, you were off on the ferry to France.
Yeah, well, I found somebody to rent my flat, and in fact, a friend ended up staying there for a bit, and I had about 6 months where I knew that I would financially survive, and I thought, well, if I maybe do a few pop-ups on the way, or I sell a few hats or a few books, I'll be able to make a bit to contribute to the journey. So I'd planned a little bit. I thought, well, I'll stay with people I know and, obviously stay in Bambi. So I set off on St. George's Day in 2015. So it's April. And it was amazing. I'll never forget that joy I felt of just setting off in the van, complete with loads of making stuff and the essentials for life on the road. I'd made sure that the van was roadworthy. It didn't have any electricity on the inside. There was no fridge. There was no water. There was no loo. But I did have a little gas hob so I could cook and make coffee or tea. So it was like camping, really. Glamping, shall we say.
Indeed.
But it was just so lovely to set off on a journey that I was in control of. So I wasn't being posted to cover something horrible. I was just doing what I wanted to do. I was just free to roam. And, given that we've all been so stuck and so hemmed in, I look back now and I think, what a joy, what a privilege that was to just set off with no agenda. I didn't really cross my mind, that I was a woman careering towards 50 and that this was a rather odd thing to do. I just didn't think about it. I just thought this will be interesting. And I'll never forget that feeling as I, drove to the ferry port and revved Bambi up into the ferry, and everyone took photographs because Bambi looked so odd and interesting. And I thought, this is good. This is good. It's sort of working. People are intrigued. And it was amazing. And I remember getting off the other side in Calais and driving to a French supermarket and buying lots of nice French treats for the journey. And then I went to Belgium and stayed with friends in Lille for a little bit. And that's where I did my first workshop with some friends' children. And from there, I sort of planned out a rough itinerary, taking in some textile locations, things that I wanted to see, people I wanted to interview, other friends who I knew would be able to put me up. And so step by step, I sort of, dotted around. I went back to Brussels where I'd worked, which was completely in contrast to my previous life, driving through the streets looking like a hippie in a wallpapered van, whereas just a few years earlier, I'd been this Eurocrat, really. And then branched out and just set off into the French countryside, not really knowing where the road would lead. It was wonderful. It was wonderful at first. It wasn't always wonderful. It was actually also quite challenging and lonely at times. It wasn't all wonderful.
No, you're very open in your book about the struggles you had at times when you suddenly realised, actually, I'm a woman on my own in potentially tricky situations that were a little bit dangerous, where you didn't know exactly where you were. And I remember one point you were saying that you'd passed a bar full of hairy bikers and you were a bit worried about them. But then a little while later, when you had an encounter with a senior gentleman who'd taken quite a fancy to you, that you were actually thinking maybe the hairy bikers had come to my rescue.
I know. I was careful in the sense that, when I set off from Brussels to set out on the open road, I remember one of my friends saying, be careful, you're a woman on your own in a camper van. There's all these reports of, attacks and blah, blah, blah. And I just thought, I was careful in the sense that I generally stayed in France. You have all the air du camping-car, so there are other people around. I don't think I ever really stayed anywhere too isolated. Although it made me early on, the first night I had in Bambi on my own was in Rheims. And I thought I was going to get to the air du camping-car and it was shut. And so I had to park just in the city centre. Luckily, I found a spot near the Cathedral, but it did made me think, gosh, you've got to be careful, you've got to be sensible. So I really wasn't a hippie just doing what I wanted. I was actually quite careful and quite sensible. I am a Virgo, and I'm not, I don't throw caution entirely to the wind. But I was as sensible as I could be without limiting the freedom I had. But there were some slightly tricky encounters that could have gone wrong, although I don't think these particular gentlemen were any particular threat. But had I been younger, had I been a bit more, less prepared, I don't know. You never know, do you? But that said, I think you have to take that balance between risk and care whenever you're travelling on your own. And I think I struck a pretty good balance most of the time. The one time I really was frightened was when I was up in this mountain roads in the Gorge du Verdon, and I hadn't prepared properly, and my sat-nav didn't work up there, and I didn't have a local map. And I found myself on this absolutely terrifying road, which was really narrow and really steep, dangerous road that was just a sheer drop on one side, and I was terrified. And I just thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. And if anything, any car would come the other way. I don't even know if it was a one-way road. I hadn't seen a sign, and I was really scared. And I just thought, I've got to carry on driving. I can't stop because, there was literally sort of rocks coming down the cliff onto the road. It was really frightening. So if anybody is going to do anything like this, please check out the locations, look at a proper map, don't just go off into the middle of nowhere, because I was really quite stupid doing that. And that really shook me, actually. And then, as you say, you can't travel on your own, I don't think. Well, I couldn't travel on my own for any length of time without having occasions where I felt really lonely and questioning what I was doing and why I was doing it and what would happen when I got back. And it was difficult being in beautiful places on your own sometimes, and I was single, I was careering towards 50. Some of the things that I'd expected to happen to me in terms of perhaps meeting someone or having children hadn't happened, and that window was closing. Certainly the children window was closing, and has now shut for all those listeners who are menopause. And it was a big, it's a time to reflect, really, as well, and to be quite sad about certain things. And crafting and making has always been a comforting thing for me, and it continues to be that. So there were definitely some moments where I did feel quite down.
Did you find it was almost therapeutic, though? Was it something you had to go through to kind of bring one part of your life, one chapter to an end, and to move off on a much more creative way, do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right, Lindsay. I think it partly was that. It was also striving for something else. So a recognition, definitely, that one part of my life was, the BBC career. I mean, I stopped listening to the news. I didn't look at stories on my phone. I just decided not to consume. I'd had it with news. I'd had it with the news. And I still feel like I've had it with the news. I don't really listen to the Today programme anymore. I don't watch television news. I don't really listen to the radio much anymore. That's a massive change from the person I was before. Now, you could maybe say, well, that's a sign of depression. I mean, maybe there's that element of it. But for a while, I needed to disconnect with that completely all-consuming 24-hour news-driven agenda and career. I just needed a complete change from it. I'd had it for 20 years. So you're right, I was drawing a line under that. I also didn't really know what I was going to do. I mean, it was this leap into the dark and a sort of striving to create something else and not knowing what that thing was. I'd done my HNC in millinery. I'd worked a bit for a milliner. I made a collection which was bought by Harvey Nichols, but it became clear to me very quickly that making hats wasn't going to make me a living. It can for some people, but it wasn't going to work for me. So I was slightly confused. I'd given up quite a lot, and it was my choice. I know that, but it was also just not quite knowing what path it was going to take next.
Now, while we're talking about being open, you pointed out in your book that this young potter arrived at Bambi and almost treated you being there as like an opportunity for a confessional, and she came and spoke to you about the fact that she was finding it difficult having a young baby and being able to be creative at the same time. It's quite interesting that sometimes it's easier to speak to strangers, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's true. It definitely is easier to speak to strangers sometimes. And yeah, I was just making a coffee in the car park in this little Italian town, and she put her head round the door and said hello in English. And yeah, she just hopped on board and we had this lovely chat. She was telling me, how she was finding motherhood difficult to combine with being a maker, and that how having a baby ate into her time and her creativity. For her, it was working out that way. But she was lovely. She was such a lovely person. And after having a coffee, she just disappeared and came back with 3 tiny little pots that she'd made, and she gave them to me. She said, here's my number if you get stuck. She was so nice. And I think when you're traveling, sometimes, especially when you're traveling on your own, you are more open to meeting people. There's a certain trust and a certain faith that you have to go into it with. Not naivety, you've got to be a bit careful, as we've discussed, but there was something, not faith exactly, but a sort of trust about the journey being good and about being right. And I did meet some lovely people, and they did treat it like a confessional, a mobile confessional, and hop on board and have a chat and just disappear again. That happened quite a lot with people. And I met some lovely people just because of the way Bambi looked. And, you know, if I had just had a plain white van, nobody would have noticed me. Nobody would have thought, oh, that's interesting, and come over to have a chat. So I was really pleased that this sort of impulse to make Bambi stand out and look creative had actually worked. And it seemed to attract generally pretty nice people.
Like-minded people, I guess, yes.
Yeah, like-minded people, exactly, yeah.
Now, you spoke in the book about consumerism and fast fashion, and how, you know, the importance of slowing down, and how when you had run one of your workshops and children had come and so many of them didn't know just how to thread a needle. How important do you think it is then that the word of making, both for sustainability and for mental health, is spread?
I think it's really, really important. And, you know, I've always been shocked really at how de-skilled kids, a lot of kids are now. At Made in Greenwich, we get lots of people coming in. I had a lady the other day who came in with her little girl saying, oh, she really wants to learn how to sew, but I don't know how to teach her. You know, do you do any sewing classes here? And a sort of generation perhaps has missed out on these skills because they didn't have them passed down to them, or perhaps for a time it wasn't fashionable, or, you know, the rise of throwaway fashion and microwave meals and, you know, just instant gratification really has pushed away some of this, these skills. I mean, I'm not a patient person by any means, and I don't like knitting or crochet particularly because they take such a long time. I mean, I do like instant results, and so I find it hard to do a project that takes a long time. You know, I've made a 1940 style dress recently, and I made it really carefully, and it took a long time, and I had to unpick it because it was too big and this and that and the other. But I love that dress. You know, I know what went into making it. I think, you know, just as a simple example, if you have a shirt and the button comes off, if you don't know how to sew that button on, you know, that shirt will just not be worn and eventually will probably get chucked away. So even something as simple as sewing on a button is going to save that shirt from landfill. And, you know, during lockdown, the second lockdown, I was staying in a bubble in North London with a couple. And, you know, I've done a few little jobs for them, taking up trousers and things like that. And, you know, they found it quite handy to have somebody around who could do that sort of thing. So I think it is really important. I mean, you know, there's been, I don't know if you have heard of a surgeon called Roger Kneebone, but he's an incredible man. And he recently, well, a few months ago, came out and said that, you know, surgeons, young surgeons who are training to do operations don't know how to sew. And actually, it's a real problem. So it's not just a question of, you know, it's a skill and it's a shame it's dying out. It's actually a practical thing that people can no longer do, and it has implications all the way up the scale. And on the simplest level, we should be able to sew a button on a shirt because it'll save it from being wasted, and it is a life skill. Surely we can all learn to do that. So I think every child in Britain ought to be taught how to sew on a button. That will be my next campaign.
Oh, I look forward to hearing about that. That's wonderful.
A button a day helps you work, rest and play. But yes, as you say as well, just for let alone all the creative side. I think often, children go to primary school, they're encouraged to be creative, they do wonderful art lessons and singing and making, and they get to secondary school and suddenly they're sometimes told not to do that. That actually they put away their toys now and get down to serious stuff. And I think that's a really terrible way to educate children. I just think that, even creativity is such an important skill, whether you're using it to create a piece of art or textile, or you're using it to solve a world problem. Creativity is something we need to encourage and grow and train people in.
I couldn't agree more, absolutely. You've finished your journey in Scotland, where you have family connections, and although not quite as glamorous and hot as the south of France and Italy, you painted a really beautiful picture of the Highlands and Montrose and going to the Edinburgh Fringe. It sounds like it was a journey metaphorically as well as physically for you on your creative road. Did you find what you were looking for on your journey?
Oh, that is $1 million question, isn't it, really? It's been interesting. People who've read the book have told me that there is this real change in tone and pace between the mainland Europe side of the journey and then going up to Scotland, which I hadn't been aware of until people mentioned it, and now reading it and reflecting on it, I think they're right. My mum died when I was in my 20s. My dad died when I was 13. And so this sense of belonging or home has always been something that I think I'm looking for. And to go back to the town my mum was born, where my brother, who's a filmmaker, now lives, was very important to me. And spending time with my family there was very important to me. And I love Scotland dearly. I love it passionately. And I feel it's a part of me. And so, in a way, I sort of hoped that the journey might resolve itself in Scotland. And indeed, I started writing the book up there and spent a year up there. But actually, I started running out of money, which is always a bit of a thing. And I couldn't find a job there. I applied for a couple of jobs up in Scotland. I didn't get them. It just didn't seem to be happening there. And I sort of thought I'm going to have to just go back down to London and try and find work, because it's getting quite critical. So I left Scotland very reluctantly, and I came back to London. I resumed my life. I did do a little bit of freelance work at the BBC, but not as much as I had before, and not on the foreign desk. I'd had it with foreign news. And then this job came up working for a charitable organisation in Greenwich, and I sort of in a panic really applied for it, doing press and PR for them and developing a brand for them. And I got it, and I was so relieved to have got a job that for a while I didn't really think of anything else other than the simple relief of having money coming in again. But I felt really disappointed as well, because I made this journey. I sort of, as you say, was hoping that this would be the gateway to something else, and it didn't really happen in the way I expected it to. So I worked for the charity, doing their press and PR and developing projects for them. But I didn't give up on the idea of writing Sew on the Go. I very much wanted to carry on doing that. But for a year or so, I didn't have any time to do it. And then I approached publishers. Nobody wanted the book. And then I heard about Unbound, which is really the world's only crowd-funded publisher. And you pitch to them like you do any other publisher. And they did like the idea. They said, we love the idea, it's great, but you're going to have to raise £16,000 to do it. And I just thought, that's impossible. I just can't do that. I can't do it. But I did. It took me 2.5 years, and I'm amazed that they let me carry on trying for that long, because it was such a slow process. And so I was working at charity, doing a bit of freelance writing, trying to crowdfund with Unbound this book. And I had a couple of very generous contributions from people towards getting this book made. And I put a bit of money into myself. And slowly, I got to the point where it had funded, and I almost couldn't believe it, really. And then I had a residency with the Hosking Houses Trust, which offers residencies to women writers over 40. And I went and wrote another bit of the book there. And then I thought, gosh, it really is going to happen. I really can make this happen. But to be honest, Lindsay, it was only last year, really, where I began to think I am actually going to do it. I'm going to publish this book. And then this year was all very fast forwarded, so it happened quite quickly in the end. But have I found what I'm looking for? It's a really difficult question to answer. I'm now, by another sort of quirk of fate, I'm now curating and running this shop and gallery for this charity, Made in Greenwich, it's called, and I work with other artists and makers, and I spend a lot of my time talking about making and creativity and making a living from making. I've moved to St Leonards-on-Sea, where I'm talking to you from. So I'm living by the sea, which is something that's become really important to me. But I don't know if I have found what I'm looking for, to be honest. I don't know, perhaps I've stopped looking for it in the way that I was before. I think I realise how lucky I am in so many ways. I love sharing. I think if I hadn't managed to publish So on the Go, I felt very frustrated. I feel that, in a way, publishing that book was sort of what I was looking for, because I don't know if I'll write any more books. I feel perhaps I won't. This is what I wanted to write right from the beginning. And I feel very emotional about this book, because it is very personal. But I've sort of perhaps stopped looking a bit for what I'm looking for and just try to appreciate more what I have. And I have a lot in comparison to a lot of people, and I just need to appreciate that more. But I don't know if creative people are ever fully satisfied, do you? I mean, there's always something more you want to make, or something more you want to say, something more you want to share. And, you'll see something fresh that will inspire you, and you'll think, ooh. I mean, the other day I bought this box covered in seashells from a second-hand shop in Hastings, and a friend staying with me at the time said, that's revolting, why on earth are you buying that? It's really kitsch and horrible. And I said, well, I love this idea of using shells to create something. Who knows where that box of shells will lead? So I don't know. I don't think we're ever of us really fully content. Maybe some people are, and they're lucky. But I'm really trying to appreciate what I have, rather than endlessly searching, perhaps for something I'll never find.
Mary Jane, it's been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for sharing your story with me.
Oh, thank you, Lindsay. And I actually feel quite tearful.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's sort of happy tears. I feel privileged to be able to talk to you and to have been able to share this book with people, because I do feel that a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, well, maybe men too, I don't know about them, I'm not sure, but I think particularly for women, as they get into their 50s, with the menopause, with a lot of changes going on in their lives, and perhaps, not having quite turned out as they expected, it's an emotional time, and there's a lot to talk about and a lot we can help each other with. So I think if this book can just be a little bit of a comfort or door onto another world, then that would be absolutely great.
Thanks so much to Mary Jane for speaking to me for Making Stitches. If you'd like to get your hands on a copy of Mary Jane's book, Sew on the Go, her publisher Unbound has very kindly offered to send a copy out to one lucky Making Stitches listener. All you need to do is answer this question, which, if you were listening carefully to our chat, should be really simple. Here goes. In which French city did Mary Jane park up with Bambi for the night next to a cathedral? The question again. In which French city did Mary Jane park up with Bambi for the night next to a cathedral? Please send your answer along with your name and address to Making Stitches Podcast, that's all one word, at gmail.com. And if you mark your email as Sew on the Go, it'll make it easier for me to spot. All the correct answers will be put into a hat and drawn out on the 1st of August 2021. So if you're listening to this episode after that date, please don't enter, as the prize draw will have already taken place. That just about brings this episode to a close, and with it, the current series of Making Stitches. I'm going to be taking a bit of a break from podcasting over the summer to wrangle children and hopefully record some new material for the new series, which will be coming your way in autumn. However, this isn't the last you'll be hearing from me until autumn, because last weekend I took part in a gentle protest of canary craftivists inspired by Sarah Corbett from the Craftivist Collective, who you may remember featured in episode 25 of Making Stitches podcast. I took my crochet hook and yarn into central Manchester to create a canary to send to my local MP to raise the pressing issue about the climate crisis. I also took my microphone with me and will be putting together a special bonus episode about our protest, which will be appearing later this summer. If you don't want to miss it or any future episodes, please make sure that you follow or subscribe to Making Stitches on your favourite podcast app. It doesn't cost anything. It's simply a matter of clicking a button, and then any future episodes will automatically appear in your podcast app of choice. Thanks again to Mary Jane Baxter for being my guest for this episode of Making Stitches, and to all my guests who took part in the third series. I can't wait to share more inspiring maker stories with you again very soon. Until then, have a great summer, take care and enjoy your crafting.